I refuse to lead animals. These 5 words were written by an American colonel in a classified cable to the Pentagon in March 1969. He was not describing enemy combatants. He was not referring to war criminals or rogue militias. He was talking about Allied soldiers, Australian soldiers, the elite operators of the Special Air Service Regiment. And what he witnessed over 72 hours in the jungles of Vietnam so horrified him that he demanded their immediate disbandment. But here is where this story takes a turn that nobody expected. 4 months later, that same colonel sent another classified message. This time, he was begging American forces to adopt the exact methods he had called barbaric. What did he see out there? What transformed a decorated veteran from moral outrage to desperate advocacy? And why did the Pentagon bury both of his cables so deep that they remained classified for decades? The Australian SAS achieved something in Vietnam that American special forces could not match: an elimination ratio of 500 to 1. 500 enemy fighters neutralized for every single Australian lost. The Americans, with all their firepower, all their helicopters, all their billions of dollars, struggled to reach 50 to 1. 10 times worse. And when American commanders asked how the Australians did it, the answers they received were so disturbing that many wished they had never asked at all. They called them the Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. Entire Viet Cong units refused to operate in areas where Australian patrols had been spotted. Captured fighters spoke of spirits and ancient evils. They did not believe they were fighting soldiers. They believed the jungle itself had turned against them. And that terror was not an accident. It was a weapon. A weapon so effective that the Pentagon classified every report about it and pretended it did not exist. What you are about to hear has been buried for over 50 years. The methods that made American officers sick to their stomachs. The psychological warfare techniques that broke enemy morale without firing a single shot. The rivalry between Allied forces that was too embarrassing for either government to acknowledge, and the transformation of ordinary Australian men into something that their own allies called animals. Stay until the end, because the final revelation, the 7 words that Colonel Patterson wrote on an index card before he passed away, will change everything you thought you knew about what it takes to win an unwinnable war. The classified cable arrived at the Pentagon on the morning of March 17, 1969, and within hours it had triggered a crisis that would be buried for decades. Colonel Harold J. Patterson, commander of Combined Operations Intelligence in Phuoc Tuy Province, had sent a message so explosive that 3 separate generals would attempt to have it destroyed before sundown. The subject line read simply, "Request for immediate disbandment of Australian SAS squadron." The body of the message contained a single devastating sentence that would haunt American military planners for years. "I refuse to lead animals," Patterson had written, "and what I have witnessed in the past 72 hours convinces me that the Australian Special Air Service has abandoned every principle of civilized warfare." But here is the question that Pentagon historians would spend decades trying to answer. If the Australian SAS were truly animals, why did they achieve a confirmed elimination ratio of 500 to 1 while American Special Operations units struggled to reach 50 to 1? If their methods were so barbaric, why did 3 separate MACV SOG commanders secretly request Australian advisors? And if Colonel Patterson was so horrified by what he witnessed, why did he submit a classified recommendation just 4 months later, urging American forces to adopt those exact same dirty methods? The truth, as it so often does in war, defied comfortable categories. And the story of how a decorated American officer went from demanding the dissolution of an Allied unit to begging for their secrets would reveal one of the most carefully hidden rivalries of the entire Vietnam conflict. Colonel Patterson had arrived in Vietnam with impeccable credentials and absolute certainty about American military superiority. A veteran of Korea, a graduate of the Army War College, and a former instructor at Fort Bragg, He embodied everything the United States military believed about itself in 1968. American firepower was unmatched. American training was the global standard. American Special Operations Forces, from the Green Berets to the Navy SEALs to the elite operators of MAC VSOG, represented the pinnacle of unconventional warfare. The idea that a small contingent of soldiers from a country with a population smaller than California could outperform them was not merely unlikely. It was, in Patterson's view, mathematically impossible. His education would begin on a sweltering Tuesday in February, when he was ordered to conduct a joint assessment of Australian SAS operations in Phuoc Tuy Province. The assignment was considered routine, almost ceremonial. The Australians had been operating in the province since 1966, running what American planners dismissively called bush patrols from their base at Nui Dat. Pentagon briefings described their contribution as modest but professional. A few hundred men conducting reconnaissance operations, nothing more, but the numbers told a different story, and it was the numbers that first made Patterson uneasy. The intelligence file waiting on his desk at Nui Dat contained statistics that should have been impossible. The Australian SAS contingent in Vietnam never exceeded 170 operators at any given time. Yet their confirmed elimination count had reached 487 enemy combatants by the time Patterson arrived. Their own losses stood at a single operator lost to hostile action, with 2 additional casualties from accidents. The ratio was so extreme that American analysts had initially assumed the Australians were inflating their numbers. 3 separate verification audits had proven otherwise. Every elimination had been confirmed by multiple sources, often including recovered enemy documents that listed specific Viet Cong cadres as neutralized by what they called the MA rung. The phantoms of the jungle. Patterson's first meeting with the Australian commanding officer did nothing to ease his growing discomfort. Major Brian Giles was a lean, weathered figure who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed entirely unimpressed by Patterson's rank or credentials. When the American colonel asked about tactical methodology, Giles offered a response that would later appear verbatim in Patterson's classified cable. "We don't fight the war the way you blokes do," Giles had said. "You lot count bodies. We hunt men. There is a difference, and if you cannot understand that difference, you have no business being in this province." The comment was insubordinate by any standard of military protocol. Patterson noted it in his field journal with the annotation, "Arrogant requires correction." He had no idea that within 72 hours, he would be the one requiring correction. The first patrol observation was scheduled for the following morning, and Patterson insisted on accompanying the Australian team despite Giles's objections. American officers had embedded with Australian units before, though rarely at Patterson's rank. The protocol was straightforward. The American would observe, take notes, and maintain strict noise discipline. Under no circumstances would he interfere with Australian tactical decisions. The 5-man SAS team assembled at 0400 hours, and Patterson immediately noticed details that troubled him. Their equipment was sparse by American standards, no helmets, just soft bush hats, weapons worn but meticulously maintained. And most disturbingly, their boots had been modified in ways that violated standard military procurement regulations. The soles had been cut and reattached to create patterns that did not resemble military footwear. When Patterson demanded an explanation, the patrol leader, a sergeant named Colin Murphy, offered a thin smile. "Charlie looks for boot prints," he explained. "Finds American boots, knows Americans are coming, finds these prints, thinks maybe just a farmer. Or maybe nothing at all. Gives us time. Time is life out here." The modification seemed clever enough, if irregular, but it was merely the first of many practices that would transform Patterson's understanding of what the Australian SAS had become in the jungles of Vietnam. The patrol moved into the bush with a silence that Patterson, despite his decades of military experience, found almost supernatural. American patrols in Vietnam operated on a principle of overwhelming response. If contact occurred, massive firepower would be brought to bear within minutes. Helicopters, artillery, air support. The jungle was an obstacle to be dominated through technological superiority. The Australians treated the jungle as something else entirely. They moved through the vegetation rather than against it, their bodies flowing around obstacles in ways that left no trace of passage. Patterson, trained to a different standard, found himself creating noise that drew sharp glances from the team. After 2 hours of movement, Murphy called a halt and approached the American with an expression that combined patience with barely concealed irritation. "Colonel," the sergeant whispered with respect, "you are walking like a pregnant water buffalo. Either learn to move like us or return to base. There is no middle ground out here." Patterson had never been spoken to in such a manner by a non-commissioned officer. Under normal circumstances, he would have demanded immediate disciplinary action. But something in Murphy's eyes, a cold certainty that belonged to a predator rather than a soldier, stopped him. He chose to learn. And what he learned over the next 48 hours would change everything he believed about modern warfare. The Australian method of patrol was built on a foundation that American doctrine had never considered. Where U.S. forces sought to find and engage the enemy, the SAS sought to become invisible until the perfect moment of vulnerability. They moved for periods of 18 to 20 hours without speaking a single word, communicating entirely through hand signals and, more disturbingly, through an almost telepathic awareness of each other's intentions. They ate cold rations only, never heating food because the smell of cooking could travel hundreds of meters in still jungle air. They defecated into plastic bags that they carried with them, leaving no biological trace. They slept in shifts of 90 minutes, never more, with each man responsible for a specific arc of observation. But it was the third morning that shattered Patterson's framework entirely. The patrol had been tracking a suspected Viet Cong supply route for 36 hours when Murphy raised his hand in a signal that meant contact imminent. Patterson watched as the 5 Australians melted into the vegetation with a speed and completeness that seemed to violate physics. One moment they were visible. The next, they had simply ceased to exist as distinguishable forms. Patterson himself was pulled into position behind a rotting log, Murphy's hand pressing firmly on his shoulder with unmistakable meaning. Do not move. Do not breathe. Do not exist. 27 minutes passed. Patterson would later confirm the duration by checking his watch repeatedly, unable to believe how slowly time moved when every heartbeat felt like a betrayal. Then, the enemy appeared. A column of 14 Viet Cong fighters moving along the trail with the confidence of men who believed themselves alone. They carried supplies, weapons, documents. They talked among themselves with the casual ease of routine. They passed within 11 meters of Patterson's position, close enough that he could see the quality of their dental work and the patches on their uniforms. The Australians let them pass. Patterson's immediate instinct was outrage. 14 confirmed enemy combatants, clearly engaged in logistical support for hostile operations, had walked directly past a 5-man SAS patrol without a single shot being fired. By any American standard, this was a failure, a missed opportunity, perhaps even a dereliction of duty. He was preparing to confront Murphy when the sergeant raised his hand again, this time with 3 fingers extended. Wait, watch, learn. What happened over the next 2 hours would become the centerpiece of Patterson's classified report and the primary evidence for his initial demand that the Australian SAS be disbanded. Murphy had noticed something that Patterson had missed entirely. One of the Viet Cong fighters, a young man walking near the rear of the column, had been limping. The limp was slight, barely perceptible, but Murphy had spotted it and drawn a conclusion that Patterson would never have reached. An injured fighter slows the column. A slowed column makes camp earlier. An earlier camp means an opportunity. The Australians tracked the enemy column for 6 additional kilometers, maintaining a distance that made contact impossible. They observed the fighters make camp exactly as Murphy had predicted, in a small clearing beside a stream. They watched the enemy post sentries, distribute food, tend to the injured fighter's leg. They counted weapons, noted leadership indicators, mapped escape routes, and then they waited for darkness. What happened next would haunt Patterson for the rest of his military career. The assault began at 02:17 hours, when the Viet Cong camp was at its most vulnerable, but assault was perhaps the wrong word for what Patterson witnessed. It was not a firefight in any conventional sense. It was a systematic elimination conducted with a precision that belonged more to surgery than combat. Murphy went in first, alone, targeting the sentries with a method that produced no sound louder than a sharp exhale. Patterson never saw exactly what weapon was used. By the time he understood what was happening, 2 sentries had simply stopped existing as threats, their bodies lowered to the ground with an almost tender care. The remaining 4 Australians moved through the camp in a pattern that had clearly been rehearsed hundreds of times. They worked in pairs, each pair responsible for a specific sector, each engagement lasting no more than 3 seconds from initiation to completion. 14 enemy combatants, 11 minutes, 0 Australian casualties, and not a single shot fired. Patterson had witnessed special operations missions before. He had observed Green Beret direct action teams in Laos. He had reviewed after-action reports from Navy SEAL operations in the Mekong Delta. Nothing he had seen or read prepared him for the cold efficiency of what the Australians had accomplished. This was not warfare as he understood it. This was something older, darker, more primal, and it was about to get worse. Murphy approached him after the clearing had been secured, and Patterson noticed for the first time that the sergeant was carrying a machete in addition to his standard equipment. The weapon was not standard issue. Its blade showed marks of repeated sharpening, and its handle had been wrapped in tape that bore dark stains Patterson chose not to examine closely. "We need to send a message," Murphy said, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man discussing routine paperwork. "Charlie has been too comfortable in this sector. Time to remind them who owns the night." What followed was the incident that would dominate Patterson's cable to the Pentagon. The Australians did not simply eliminate the enemy fighters and recover intelligence materials. They did not call for extraction or establish a defensive perimeter. Instead, they spent 47 minutes arranging the scene in ways that defied every principle of military conduct Patterson had ever learned. Bodies were positioned in specific configurations, certain items were removed and others were placed. Symbols were carved into tree trunks using Murphy's machete, and most disturbingly, evidence was left behind that would suggest the camp had been attacked not by organized military forces, but by something else entirely. Something supernatural. Something that could not be fought with rifles and grenades. "This is how you create fear," Murphy explained when he noticed Patterson's expression. "Americans think firepower wins wars. Firepower wins battles. Fear wins wars. When Charlie finds this camp tomorrow, he will not think Australian soldiers did this. He will think the spirits of the jungle have turned against him. He will tell other fighters what he saw. Those fighters will tell others. Within a month, entire units will refuse to operate in this sector. That is worth more than 100 airstrikes, Colonel." Patterson demanded that Murphy cease the psychological operation immediately. Murphy's response was to turn away and continue his work as if the American officer had not spoken at all. The return to Nui Dat took another 18 hours, during which Patterson spoke not a single word to any member of the patrol. His mind was churning through implications, regulations, moral frameworks. What he had witnessed violated the Geneva Conventions in multiple specific ways. The treatment of enemy remains, the psychological warfare tactics, the deliberate creation of terror rather than simple military defeat. These were not the methods of a professional military force. These were the methods of, well, Patterson struggled to find the right word. Animals. The word came to him on the helicopter flight back to his own headquarters. He had been searching for a term that captured what he had observed, and animals was the only word that fit. Not because the Australians lacked intelligence or discipline, quite the opposite. Their intelligence was profound, and their discipline absolute. But they had crossed a line that separated human soldiers from something more primitive. They had become predators in the most literal sense, and predators did not follow the rules of civilized combat. His cable to the Pentagon was composed that same evening, drafted in a state of moral certainty that would seem almost quaint in retrospect. The Australian SAS has abandoned the ethical foundations of Western military tradition, Patterson wrote. Their methods, while undeniably effective in narrow tactical terms, represent a regression to barbarism that the United States cannot and should not condone. I recommend immediate suspension of all joint operations and formal diplomatic communication, urging the Australian government to disband this unit and investigate potential war crimes. The cable was transmitted at 21:47 hours on March 17, 1969. By the following morning, Patterson's career had effectively ended. The response from Pentagon leadership was swift and devastating, but not in the direction Patterson had expected. Instead of launching an investigation into Australian SAS methods, 3 separate generals contacted Patterson with variations of the same message. His cable had been received, noted, and would be filed in a classification category that essentially meant it would never be seen again. More importantly, Patterson was informed that his assessment role had been terminated and that he would be reassigned to a logistics position in Saigon, effective immediately. The official explanation was routine rotation. The unofficial message was unmistakable. Patterson had stumbled into something that powerful people wanted to remain hidden. And the reasons for that concealment would only become clear months later, when he gained access to files that should never have crossed his desk. What Patterson discovered in those files transformed his outrage into something far more complicated. The Australian SAS methods he had witnessed were not aberrations. They were not the result of poor leadership or inadequate oversight. They were the product of deliberate development, systematic training, and results that American forces had been trying unsuccessfully to replicate for years. The statistics buried in those classified files told a story that no Pentagon briefing would ever acknowledge publicly. American Special Operations units in Vietnam, including the legendary MACV-SOG, operated at elimination ratios that rarely exceeded 50-1. For every 50 enemy combatants neutralized, approximately 1 American operator was lost. This was considered excellent by historical standards, far superior to conventional infantry ratios. The Australian SAS ratio stood at approximately 500-1. The disparity was so extreme that American analysts had developed multiple theories to explain it, none of them complementary to U.S. methods. Some argued that the Australians were operating in easier terrain, though Phuoc Tuy Province was demonstrably as challenging as any American area of operations. Others suggested that Australian counting methods were inflated, though verification audits had repeatedly confirmed their accuracy. A third faction simply refused to believe the numbers and attributed them to statistical anomalies. But a small group of American officers had reached a different conclusion, one that Patterson was now forced to confront. The Australian SAS was achieving superior results because their methods were superior. The psychological warfare, the body positioning, the deliberate creation of supernatural terror, these were not barbaric impulses but calculated tactical innovations. And they worked. The evidence was overwhelming once Patterson knew where to look. In sectors where Australian SAS had operated, Viet Cong recruitment dropped by an average of 63% within 3 months. Enemy patrols showed measurably decreased aggression, with fighters reportedly refusing assignments in areas believed to be haunted by the MA rung. Intelligence recovered from captured documents revealed that entire VC units had been dissolved due to desertions attributed to fear of the jungle spirits. One particularly striking report described a North Vietnamese political officer who had been sent to investigate morale problems in Phuoc Tuy. His conclusion, recorded in a document captured during a later operation, stated that the Australian devils had found a way to turn the jungle itself against the revolution. None of this should have been possible according to American doctrine. Psychological warfare was supposed to require mass communication, leaflet drops, loudspeaker broadcasts, propaganda campaigns. The idea that 5 men with machetes and careful positioning could achieve greater psychological impact than B-52 bombing raids seemed absurd. And yet the evidence suggested exactly that conclusion. Patterson spent 3 weeks reviewing classified files, interviewing American officers who had worked alongside Australian units, and gradually assembling a picture that contradicted everything he had written in his original cable. The Australian SAS were not animals. They were something far more dangerous. They were professionals who had recognized a truth that American military culture refused to accept. In unconventional warfare, perception mattered more than destruction. The transformation in Patterson's thinking culminated in a second classified document, this one sent through channels so restricted that fewer than a dozen people would ever read it. Dated July 19, 1969, exactly 4 months after his call for disbandment, the document carried the subject line, "Urgent recommendation for integration of Australian SAS psychological warfare methods into American Special Operations doctrine." The reversal was complete, and Patterson made no attempt to disguise it. "I was wrong," he wrote in the opening paragraph. "My initial assessment was based on ethical frameworks developed for conventional warfare and inappropriate for the operational environment we face in Vietnam. The Australian SAS has developed methods that, while disturbing to observe, represent a quantum leap in unconventional warfare effectiveness. I strongly recommend that American Special Operations Forces be authorized to study and adopt these methods immediately. The specific recommendations that followed read like a manual for exactly the practices Patterson had previously condemned. Systematic psychological warfare through manipulation of enemy remains. Deliberate creation of supernatural fear through staging and positioning. Extended silent patrols designed to make American forces invisible to enemy tracking. Integration of indigenous tracking methods into standard operational procedure. And most significantly, a fundamental shift from the American doctrine of overwhelming firepower to the Australian doctrine of precise, terrifying, personally intimate engagement. Patterson's recommendations were read, noted, and filed in the same classification void that had swallowed his original cable. But copies were made by officers who recognized their value, and elements of those recommendations would gradually filter into American Special Operations training over the following decades, though always without attribution and always with careful denial. The story might have ended there, buried in classified archives and remembered only by the handful of officers who had witnessed the strange case of Colonel Patterson's transformation. But the rivalry between American and Australian Special Forces continued to generate incidents that demanded explanation, and the explanations kept leading back to the same uncomfortable truths. In October of 1969, a Navy SEAL team operating in the Mekong Delta requested emergency extraction after discovering what they initially described as a massacre. 13 Viet Cong fighters had been eliminated in a small village, their bodies arranged in patterns that the SEAL team leader described as ritualistic and potentially indicative of a serial predator operating in the area. The team had refused to continue their mission, convinced that they had stumbled into the hunting ground of something inhuman. Investigation revealed that an Australian SAS patrol had passed through the area 48 hours earlier. The elimination pattern and body positioning matched Australian psychological warfare doctrine precisely. The SEAL team had been so effectively terrorized by methods designed to frighten the enemy that they had abandoned their own operation. The incident generated a classified after-action report that used language strikingly similar to Patterson's original cable. But unlike Patterson's complaint, this report was accompanied by a request. The SEAL commander wanted to know how the Australians had achieved such profound psychological impact and whether American units could be trained in similar methods. The requests kept coming throughout 1970 and into 1971. Green Beret team leaders in the Central Highlands asked for Australian advisors. MACV SOG commanders submitted classified queries about SAS training methodology. Even conventional infantry officers, observing the mysterious calm that seemed to settle over areas where Australians had operated, began asking questions that their superiors could not or would not answer. The Australian response to these requests was consistent and frustrating. Major Giles, when asked to host American trainees, replied that Australian methods required a particular type of soldier and that Americans had not yet demonstrated the necessary qualities. When pressed to define those qualities, Giles offered a response that would become legendary among special operations historians. "Our blokes learn to become part of the jungle," he explained. "Your blokes want to conquer it. Until Americans understand that the jungle is not their enemy, but their weapon, they cannot learn what we teach." The philosophical gap Giles described was real, and it was profound. American military culture in Vietnam was built on a foundation of technological superiority: helicopters, artillery, air support, electronic surveillance. These tools were meant to overcome the disadvantages of fighting in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy with local knowledge. The Australian approach was fundamentally different. Instead of overcoming the terrain, they had learned to use it. Instead of fighting the jungle, they had become part of it. And that transformation required a psychological shift that most American soldiers found impossible to achieve. The records of attempted integration make for painful reading even today. In February of 1970, a pilot program was established to train selected American special operators in Australian SAS methodology. 12 Green Berets were chosen for the program, all of them volunteers with exceptional records. They were sent to Nui Dat for a 60-day immersion course conducted by Australian instructors. 9 of the 12 withdrew before the program concluded. Their reasons, recorded in debriefing documents, reveal the depth of the cultural divide. "The Australians wanted us to unlearn everything," one sergeant reported. "They said our training made us loud, obvious, and predictable. They said we moved through the jungle like we were angry at it. And maybe we were. But when I tried to move the way they did, to think the way they did, I felt like I was losing myself. Like I was becoming something I did not want to be." Another participant was more specific. "They taught us to see the enemy as prey," he recorded. "Not soldiers, not enemies, not threats. Prey. And once you start thinking that way, once you really believe it, you cross a line that is hard to come back from. I saw what that line did to them. I did not want it to do the same thing to me." The 3 Americans who completed the program returned to their units with mixed results. Their tactical effectiveness improved dramatically, with confirmed elimination ratios approaching Australian levels, but their psychological assessments showed troubling changes. 2 of the 3 were eventually discharged with diagnoses that would today be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. The 3rd continued to serve but refused to discuss his training at Nui Dat for the rest of his career. Meanwhile, the Australians continued their operations with undiminished effectiveness. The 1970 campaigning season saw SAS patrols achieving results that defied rational analysis. A single 5-man patrol in July eliminated 23 confirmed enemy combatants over a 14-day operation without suffering any casualties. Another patrol in September discovered and neutralized an entire Viet Cong command cell, recovering intelligence that would take American analysts months to fully exploit. And in October, an SAS operation codenamed Donut achieved what Pentagon historians would later describe as the single most effective psychological warfare action of the entire conflict. The details of Donut remain partially classified even today, but enough has emerged to understand its impact. A suspected VC training camp had been identified in a remote area of Phuoc Tuy Province, believed to contain between 40 and 60 fighters. American doctrine would have called for an airstrike followed by conventional ground assault. The Australians proposed something different. Over a period of 3 weeks, SAS patrols systematically eliminated the camp's perimeter security without triggering any alert. The methods used were identical to those Patterson had witnessed months earlier: silent approach, precise engagement, careful staging of remains to suggest supernatural rather than human agency. By the time the main assault occurred, the camp's surviving occupants had been reduced to a state of psychological paralysis. 27 fighters were found hiding in bunkers, refusing to emerge. 11 had deserted during the previous week, their departure triggered by terror rather than tactical consideration. The entire camp was neutralized with 0 Australian casualties and minimal ammunition expenditure. The after-action report noted that several captured fighters had to be sedated before they could be interrogated. When questioned about their condition, they spoke of spirits, of ghosts, of an ancient evil that had awakened in the jungle to punish them. They did not believe they had been defeated by soldiers. They believed they had been destroyed by something beyond human understanding. Colonel Patterson learned of the donut operation through unofficial channels, and it forced him to confront a question that had been building since his transformation in July. If the Australian methods were so effective, if they achieved results that American forces could not match through any conventional means, why was the Pentagon so determined to bury every report that documented their success? The answer, when Patterson finally pieced it together, revealed a truth about military bureaucracy that was almost as disturbing as the Australian methods themselves. The problem was not that Australian SAS tactics were barbaric. Pentagon leadership had tolerated and even encouraged practices in Vietnam that pushed the boundaries of ethical warfare. The problem was that Australian success exposed American failure in ways that could not be bureaucratically managed. If the Australian SAS could achieve 500 to 1 elimination ratios with 5-man patrols, what did that say about American units achieving 50 to 1 with massive logistical support? If psychological warfare conducted by small teams could pacify areas that air power could not control, what justified the expenditure of billions of dollars on bombing campaigns? And most dangerously, if the Australians had developed superior methods through adaptation and innovation, what did that say about the American military's assumption of inherent superiority? These were not questions that generals wanted to answer. These were not conclusions that defense contractors wanted Congress to examine. And so the Australian success was buried, minimized, attributed to local conditions and statistical anomalies. The rivalry continued, but it was a rivalry that only one side was allowed to acknowledge. Patterson's final contribution to this hidden history came in February of 1971, when he was rotated back to the United States for what proved to be his terminal assignment. Before leaving Vietnam, he conducted one last interview with Major Giles, a conversation that was recorded unofficially and transcribed into Patterson's personal papers. The exchange captured a philosophical divide that would take decades to bridge. Patterson asked why the Australians had developed methods that seemed so at odds with Western military tradition. Giles' response occupied several pages of transcript, but could be summarized in a single insight. "You Americans came to Vietnam believing you were bringing civilization to the jungle," Giles explained. "We came understanding that the jungle has its own civilization, far older than ours, and that we would have to learn its ways to survive. Your soldiers fight against Vietnam. Our soldiers fight with it. That is not a tactical difference. It is a spiritual one. And until you understand that, you will never understand what we do or why it works." Patterson pressed further, asking whether the Australian methods could ever be replicated by American forces. Giles was doubtful. "Your culture will not allow it," he said. "You are too proud, too certain, too attached to the idea that technology conquers everything. We came from a country built by convicts and pioneers who learned early that the land was not their servant, but their master. We learned to adapt or perish. Americans have never learned that lesson, and I suspect you never will. Your strength is also your weakness. You believe you can impose your will on any environment through sufficient application of power. We know that some environments cannot be conquered, only joined." The Vietnam War ended in April of 1975, and with it ended the operational history of Australian SAS in that conflict. Their final statistics would be compiled, classified, and largely forgotten. 582 confirmed enemy eliminations. 2 operators lost to hostile action over the entire course of the deployment, a ratio that remains unmatched in modern military history. The lessons they had developed, the methods they had pioneered, would gradually filter into special operations doctrine around the world. The psychological warfare techniques that Patterson had initially condemned would become standard training in counterinsurgency programs. The silent patrol methodology would influence British, American, and Israeli Special Forces development. And the fundamental insight that Giles had articulated, that unconventional warfare requires becoming part of the environment rather than dominating it, would eventually be recognized as one of the most important tactical innovations of the 20th century. But none of this happened quickly or publicly. The rivalry that Patterson had witnessed remained hidden for decades, acknowledged only in classified briefings and retired officers' memoirs. The dirty methods that had so horrified him were never officially endorsed by American military leadership, even as they were quietly incorporated into training programs. And the question of whether the Australian approach represented tactical genius or moral regression was never definitively answered. Patterson himself retired in 1973, his career effectively ended by the cables he had written and the questions he had raised. He spent his final years in a small house in Virginia, corresponding with other veterans and occasionally contributing to classified historical projects. In 1987, he granted a recorded interview to an Army historian that was not declassified until 2006. The interview concluded with a reflection that captured the ambiguity of his entire experience. "I went to Vietnam believing I understood warfare," Patterson said. "I believed there were rules, boundaries, principles that separated civilized soldiers from barbarians. The Australians showed me that those boundaries were illusions we had created to comfort ourselves. They fought the war that actually existed, not the war we wished existed, and they won because of it. Whether that makes them heroes or monsters, I honestly cannot say. Perhaps both. Perhaps that is what war does to men who truly master it. It makes them something that civilized people cannot entirely accept and cannot do without." The recording ended there, and Patterson declined to elaborate further. He passed away in 1992 without ever publicly discussing his Vietnam experiences again, but his papers, donated to the Army War College after his passing, contained a final notation that seemed to summarize his decades of reflection. Written on a single index card, found in the file containing his original cable calling for the SAS to be disbanded, were 7 words that captured the entire arc of his transformation. "I was wrong. They were warriors." The Australian SAS veterans of Vietnam returned to a country that was not particularly interested in celebrating their achievements or examining their methods. Unlike their American counterparts, they did not face significant protests or public hostility, but they also did not receive the recognition that their extraordinary record might have warranted. The culture of silence that had developed within the SAS extended to civilian life, and most veterans spoke little about what they had done or how they had done it. Occasionally, interviews surfaced that provided glimpses into the psychology that had made their success possible. Sergeant Colin Murphy, the patrol leader who had so disturbed Patterson during that fateful March operation, granted a single interview in 1989. When asked about the methods that had generated such controversy among American observers, Murphy offered a perspective that echoed Major Giles but added a dimension of personal cost. "They called us animals," Murphy recalled. "The Americans, I mean. And maybe there was something to it. You cannot do what we did, think the way we thought, without changing something fundamental about yourself. We became hunters, not soldiers, not warriors, hunters. And hunting humans is different from hunting anything else. It requires you to understand them, to predict them, to know them better than they know themselves. And when you develop that kind of understanding, when you can look at another human being and see only prey, something breaks inside you that never quite heals." Murphy declined to elaborate on what that broken thing might be, but he hinted at difficulties that had followed him home. "I sleep poorly," he admitted. "I dream of the jungle still. And sometimes, in those dreams, I am not certain whether I am the hunter or the hunted. Perhaps both. Perhaps that is the price of what we became." The legacy of the Australian SAS experience in Vietnam would continue to influence special operations thinking long after the last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon. American special forces, particularly those engaged in counterinsurgency operations, would gradually adopt elements of the methodology that Patterson had first documented and condemned: the emphasis on psychological warfare, the integration of indigenous knowledge, the shift from firepower to fieldcraft. These became standard elements of advanced training programs by the 1990s. But the full truth about the rivalry, about the statistical disparity, about the classified cables and buried recommendations, would remain hidden for decades longer. It was not until the 2000s that historians began piecing together the complete picture from declassified documents and veteran interviews. And even then, the story was complicated by questions of national pride, military bureaucracy, and the fundamental discomfort that competent people feel when confronted with evidence that someone else was simply better. The Australian veterans, for the most part, remained silent about the controversy. They had done their job, achieved their objectives, and returned home. The questions of whether their methods were ethical, whether their success should have been more widely studied, whether the American refusal to learn from them constituted institutional arrogance, these were questions for historians and analysts. For the men who had actually served, the only relevant question was whether they had kept their mates alive and accomplished their missions. By that standard, no other special operations force in Vietnam could match their record. Colonel Patterson's phrase, "I refuse to lead animals," would echo through military history circles for years after his papers became available to researchers. It was cited in academic studies of inter-allied rivalry, in classified training documents about psychological warfare, and in countless informal discussions among special operations veterans. The phrase became shorthand for a particular kind of moral blindness, the inability to recognize effective methodology because it violated comfortable assumptions about what civilized warfare should look like. But there was another way to interpret Patterson's words, one that his later reflection suggested he had himself come to understand. Perhaps the Australian SAS had indeed become something other than conventional soldiers. Perhaps their methods did represent a kind of devolution to more primitive forms of combat. But perhaps that devolution was exactly what the jungle demanded. Perhaps the choice in unconventional warfare was not between civilized and barbaric methods, but between effective and ineffective ones. And perhaps the true animals were those who clung to comfortable illusions while their soldiers died in greater numbers than necessary. These questions have no easy answers, and Patterson's journey from condemnation to advocacy suggests that even participants in the event struggled to resolve them. What remains clear is that the Australian SAS in Vietnam developed and perfected methods that achieved results far beyond what conventional doctrine predicted possible. Whether those methods represented the future of special operations or a necessary aberration specific to that conflict, whether they should be studied and replicated or remembered and rejected, these remain matters of legitimate debate. The final word might appropriately belong to Major Brian Giles, who commanded Australian SAS operations in Vietnam during the period of greatest controversy and achievement. In a rare public speech delivered in 1994, Giles reflected on the legacy of his unit and the lessons it might hold for future conflicts. "We were asked to do something impossible," Giles said. "Hold territory, gather intelligence, destroy enemy capability, and do it all with fewer men than an American company would assign to a single patrol. We succeeded because we refused to fight the war we were expected to fight. We refused to measure success by body counts or territory controlled. We refused to believe that firepower was the answer to every problem. And most importantly, we refused to see the jungle as our enemy. The jungle became our weapon, our shield, our home. And once we understood that, once we truly became part of that environment, the enemy could not stand against us. They called our methods dirty, Giles continued, barbaric, uncivilized. Perhaps they were right. But I would remind those critics that war itself is dirty, barbaric, and uncivilized. The question is not whether your methods are pleasant, but whether they achieve your objectives while keeping your men alive. By that measure, the only measure that ultimately matters, we succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. And if that success required us to become something that peacetime societies find uncomfortable to acknowledge, so be it. That is the price of victory. The question is whether you are willing to pay it. The audience response to Giles' speech was mixed. Some veterans stood and applauded. Others remained seated with expressions that suggested deep ambivalence. A few walked out entirely. The division in that audience mirrored the larger division in military thinking that had characterized the Australian SAS experience from the beginning. Today, more than 50 years after Colonel Patterson sent his controversial cable, the debate continues. Military historians still argue about whether the Australian SAS methods represent a model for future special operations or a cautionary tale about the psychological costs of unconventional warfare. Veterans from both nations still disagree about whether the rivalry was productive or destructive, whether the American refusal to learn was arrogant or prudent, and the fundamental questions that Patterson raised in his original message remain unresolved. What distinguishes a warrior from an animal? Where is the line between effective tactics and moral transgression? Can methods that violate conventional ethics be justified by their results? And if they can, what does that say about the ethics we claim to uphold? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that the Australian SAS experience forces us to confront. The Phantoms of Phuoc Tuy Province achieved something remarkable, something that conventional military doctrine said was impossible. They did it through methods that disturbed many of those who witnessed them. And they left behind a legacy that continues to influence special operations thinking around the world, even when that influence is not officially acknowledged. Colonel Patterson began his journey by refusing to lead animals. He ended it by recognizing that perhaps the animals were the ones who truly understood what warfare demanded. The transformation he underwent, from certainty to doubt to reluctant admiration, mirrors the journey that many observers have taken when they study the Australian SAS in Vietnam. It is not a comfortable journey, but it is an honest one. And in matters of war and peace, honesty may be the only virtue that ultimately endures.